Hi, I'm Rachel and I'm here to do the Apple tag. I was tagged by Steve Donahue and the tag was created by Josh from Literary Gladiators, so I'll link their videos down below. When Steve tagged me, he was gracious enough to mention my cat Leia, who died a couple of weeks ago, and to express empathy about the whole grieving process, so it was very kind. And so I'm trying to get into the stage of talking about Leia in an optimistic, happy light again. So I thought I'd just take a quick moment to post another picture up here and talk about it a little bit. When I lived in my old apartment complex, on every birthday they'd send, or well, leave at the door, a card. It was pretty much a corporate card. And then they'd also have a nice little balloon. And one year I brought in my balloon and Leia was very taken with the string, and I just really love that look on her face. It looks like a grin, and it's been my work computer background for years. So on to the tag. I have some physical copies of the books I'll be talking about and some I don't, but I'll show what I have as we go along. I also have the questions over here on my phone. So question 1 is, Granny Smith, an overbearingly sweet worker character. I decided to go with Thomason from The Return of the Native by Thomas Hardy, which was my buddy read with Curtis from Curtis Books and Films before he went off to be much more famous in Shakespeare. Anyway, Thomason is the sweet and trusting wife of rather dubious character Wild Eve. He's kind of a bit of a player in life and in love. He owns an inn that features the image of a headless lady, and he's constantly gambling and, you know, encouraging gambling and then going behind her back for carrying on his affairs. And meanwhile, she's just so sweet and so innocent. And every now and then you kind of just want to shake her and say, come on, Thomason, and why don't you fight back a little bit? At least start a book club in the inn or something. Something to piss him off a little bit. So question 2 is Fuji, a work about a mountain. And I'm definitely cheating here a little bit. I'm not going for a mountain. I'm going for a plateau. I'm going for The Dovekeepers by Alice Hoffman, which was my favorite book from a couple of years ago that I read. And it's chronicling the lives of 3 or 4 women during the Siege of Masada, which was a Roman-era siege when the Romans were trying to snuff out Jewish rebellion in Israel. And it ended in the Israelites doing a mass suicide rather than, you know, ultimately surrendering to the Romans, who had superior tactical power. But this book was much more about the lives of these women, and I just found it really fascinating, and the characters really came alive for me, and it made me very intrigued about Hoffman's historical fiction. Question 3 is Red Delicious, a book that would be perfect if it were only judged by its cover. So I feel like this question is encouraging you to pick a book where the cover is good, but the actual content of the book not so much. But I don't really have that, because I immediately, whenever I think of a wonderful cover, go back to this experience from the summer when I was in Kansas City with my family, where they live, and we were going to a bunch of indie bookstores. And at Rainy Day Books, I bought Modern Lovers by Emma Straub, and afterwards I wanted to take a bookstagram picture, so I sort of put it up into the sunlight to try to get it next to the sign in the distance, and I couldn't even see anything, but when I ultimately clicked the shutter and took a look at the picture that I took, it turned out so wonderful. I love it so much. I'll link to the picture down below. And I have yet to read the book, but I'm really hoping that the content is as good as this cover. Question 4 is Golden Yellow, a book with yellow on the cover. In another recent video, I highlighted the book The Beast is an Animal. It's somewhere back here. It was something that I won from LitHub earlier this year. So I thought now I would highlight 2 other books that I won from LitHub earlier this year that fit this challenge. The first one is Free Food for Millionaires by Min-Jing Lee. It's the book that she wrote most immediately before Pachinko, which is her current and rather famous book that is out right now. This one takes place in America, but with Korean characters and Korean-American characters. Though again, I haven't read it yet. This next book is also about South Korea during the 70s with university students during a rather politically tumultuous time. It's Everything Belongs to Us by Yoojin Grace Wuertz. And I also haven't read this one yet. Hey, both of them have yellow on the cover. Question 5 is Macintosh, a writer that has influenced or would influence your writing. I've been worried lately that I haven't given enough serious analytical thought to short story writers, considering that I am one, that I write short stories, and that I should try to, you know, have some influences and proverbial mentors, if you will. But I keep going back to my favorite authors, although I suppose there is something to say for that, because I obviously love them for a certain reason. I think the one that most applies to the short form is Jhumpa Lahiri, because her short stories, I just remember them being as evocative and fully formed as a novel. I mean, it can't be as long as and complex as a novel, but the worlds felt as rich as if they were one. It's a shame, really. I think, like many other people, I can remember novels so much easier than short stories, but particularly from her second short story collection, Unaccustomed Earth, I remember the story, let me look up the actual name of it, A Choice of Accommodations, where the protagonist returns to his boarding school for a wedding, and it's just an awkward juxtaposition of worlds. And Nobody's Business is told from the point of view of a non-Indian roommate, so it's kind of like seeing that culture from the outside a bit. And then I remember there was something about alcoholism in a Bengali family, and a story about a father and a daughter relationship in adulthood. And I feel like I should probably reread her short story collections or buy them. I don't actually have them. Another of my favorite authors is Allegra Goodman, and my favorite of her novels are the ones that are really about insular communities and probing different aspects of what makes people tick and why they believe in the common cause that they do, or how they struggle within believing in or not believing in that common cause, but being part of that community. So it's almost like that could be akin to interconnected short stories, which she also did in her short story collection, I believe, about the Hawaiian Jewish community, and she'd go back and forth between different members of the community to tell their perspectives. I really admire that. And finally, there's Meg Wolitzer, who's just a little bit younger than my mother, and I think I almost see her as a mentor in that way, about how she describes women and sexuality and Jewish women when they appear in her stories and her novels. And I just appreciate the ways that she delves into issues of sex and relationships. And in Surrender Dorothy, my favorite of her novels that I've read this year, about an untimely death and how a relationship with someone is like placing that person within a supporting role in your own sense of self and narrative. I mean, it's strange. It's almost a little bit cynical in a way, because everybody sees things so differently and a little bit in a self-absorbed way. But that's human nature. That's what we have to deal with. I just feel like all three of these authors get something true and complex about the nature of humanity and how we see ourselves in our worlds, and that's definitely something that drives me in my fiction. Question 6 is Honeycrisp, a book you have read that is in great demand. I think this one is pretty literal. I'm going with Hidden Figures by Margot Lee Shetterly. I was on the holds list at my library for this book, which is the nonfiction accounting of African-American mathematicians during mid-century at NASA. I was at the holds list for 8 months, and that was the large text version, because I think the other version had an even longer wait list. Maybe they just pulled them all together because of demand, but that was the longest I ever had to wait, and of course I don't have the book anymore because there were plenty of people behind me that needed it after I finished. Question 7 is Baldwin. A writer you feels needs recognition due to stunted acclaim, whether due to something that happened to them or a premature death. I think with the case I have to show you, the reason for her stunted acclaim is several reasons. She published quite late in life, started publishing quite late in life, and she's predominantly a short story writer, which is far less popular than novels. And also she's Canadian, which as an American, I'm embarrassed to say that I think unless things are published here, we don't hear much about them. But, well, I first found out about this when it came across my desk at work, and so then I ultimately finally got around to buying myself a copy. And I showed it a couple of weeks ago, but I didn't actually put the book name in the description of the video, so now I'm glad to be able to do that. It's A Basket of Apples by Shirley Faessler. It's a very short story collection, 6 stories about Jewish immigrants in the Toronto area in the early to mid-1900s, 20th century. Very much based on Faessler's life. This is a rendition of the author right here. And again, speaking of short stories I should aspire to, well, one thing I liked is, or am intrigued by, is what she did with form, because I guess I'll talk about form at long last, and because her stories would start like in the future, and then the character would be delving into specific relationships and issues from the past that sort of indirectly relate to whatever's going on in the future. So it was an interesting complexity going on there, and again, very evocative characters that kept you very invested. And I'd encourage you to check her out. Question 8 is Empire, a work about or set in New York. I'm going with Visible City, which is a novel by another of my favorite authors, Tova Mirvis. I don't think this is my favorite of her novels. It's probably a little further down the pike, but I did still very much enjoy it. And for her, it was very much an ode to New York, because she wrote it... well, actually, she wrote it after she left New York, but in the spirit of missing the city. And it's about these neighbors who can spy on each other through their windows from their apartments, as you do in large cities. I can do that. And how they get invested in each other's lives, but also how much they don't really understand or know about each other, and how much you can sort of transfer your own feelings and your own jealousies or resentments or hopes onto what you think is the other person's life. And so it's a great character study in that way. I really enjoy it. Question 9 is Gala, a work that fits under many genres. I'm using this question as an excuse to start talking about my Jewish Alternative Histories project, which I've been talking about on several videos lately, that I want to write a script and review the 3 books that I read last month. My favorite of those 3 was JUDENSTAAT by Simone Zelitch. And I'm saying that it's multi-genre because I think that it kind of is. But in this case, I'm going with the fact that there's a mystery aspect to this, where there's a whodunit plot, where certain characters come to the protagonist to say, your husband didn't die the way that you think he did, and also our country wasn't founded with a narrative that is completely as sleek as you think it is. And then it's an alternate history because Judenstaat is a fake country, but Zelitch imagines that after World War II and the Holocaust, instead of Israel, Germany gave over basically what became East Germany to become a land for the displaced Jews, which they called Judenstaat, State of the Jews. And it's an interesting, I think, conversation with history, which is, I think, surprisingly realist for history that's not real at all, because there's so much about the politics and identity that is similar to the politics and identity of Israel, and I believe of East Germany and the issues that they faced in the past. And it definitely made me want to read more histories. And I just found it very compelling. I don't think the characters were all that well drawn out, but in terms of the ideas, there were a lot of really compelling ideas about identity and nationality and history and memory and trauma. And yeah, this one dealt with it the best out of the three that I've read last month, I believe. Question 10 is Ambrosia, a long work that was easy to follow. I'm going with my favorite so far read of this year, The End of the Land by David Grossman. It's about, looks like almost 600 pages long, which is long for a novel in most cases. And it feels like, in a way, this shouldn't be easy to follow, and I think for people who like plot, I don't think they'd like it as much or follow it as easily as I do, where I love stream of consciousness and deep dives into characters, and so I just dived deep into this work because it takes place during a military skirmish in Israel where the main character's son is called up for duty near the end of his term. And she's feeling pretty convinced that he could die, and she doesn't want to stay in her house and just wait for the news of that, so she decides to go out into the Galilee with the boy's father, with whom she has a rather complicated history, and they walk through the wilderness and hash out through the boy's life and through their own lives and their own messy history of several decades. And occasionally, you know, we are interrupted by the present. Every now and then something happens in the present, but mostly we're in the past and just sifting through their stories, and it was just fascinating and rich and beautiful and sad, and I loved it. Question 11 is Jazz, a work written in or after 2010 that demonstrates freshness and originality. This question, I think, intimidates me the most. I just don't know if I read enough every year to be able to answer this. I don't. You know, follow new releases, but I don't always read them. I don't know. Anyway, I decided to go for another sort of strange avenue into this answer. And I'm choosing Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, which might actually fit the bill. It touched a lot of people's hearts, including my own. It was one of my favorite books when I read it a couple of years ago, where it melds sort of post-apocalyptic fiction with something more literary about hope for humanity and the meaning of technology and of art. But I have a more specific reason for choosing it for this too. Because I think it's the first fiction book that my father has read since 2010. So there we go. I gave it to him to read years ago, at least a couple of years ago, I think shortly after I finished it, because I thought he'd like it, and it stood on his nightstand. And then I inundated him with a bunch of other books, mostly the dad books, the histories, the biographies, stuff that I hoped he'd like, but I think he mostly was intimidated by all the books, and so I cooled it for a while, and he hadn't been reading, but then lo and behold, he was on vacation this week, and he told me, I picked up Station 11, and I started reading it, and I'm really loving it. So that was very exciting for me. And now he's reading a historical fiction book, and he's back into reading, it seems, so yay! That is definitely something fresh and original for my family. I feel like I should follow his example. Lately I've been watching too much TV, I think, when I get home, and I'm still reading a fair amount, but I'm reading slower than I could be. So it's easy to get into that habit of forgetting how to read regularly, you know. Question 12 is Mutsu, a big book that you indulged. I don't think I indulge a lot of big books. I have a sweet spot for the standard novel size, the 250 to 350 pages, I guess, novel size. But whenever I get a question about, I guess, indulging a large book, my mind goes back to my teenage years when I read The Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley, because I wasn't as structured in my reading with as many deadlines back then, and I think I read it over several months. And I just remember lounging on my bed or lounging in my closet and just reading bits and pieces of that book for a long time during the summer. So that seems to fit the bill. Question 13 is, what is your favorite apple? I think for me, my favorite is the Rome apple. I like that apple that is a light red color, somewhere between green and red, mostly red, but not the dark red, because I find those apples to be kind of too mushy and too sweet. But then I find like the granny apple or something too green to be too tart. So I constantly am looking for apples that are like red enough for me. And for a while, my grocery store had the Rome apples, and they were great, but they haven't had those for a while. And now, of late, I've been on this apple, and it's the Fuji apple. Like, hello, we were just talking about you. And I go to the grocery store, and you can see that some of it is kind of green, and a lot of them can be pretty green, but I look for the ones that are as red as possible. And so I get just that right balance of something sweet but not too sweet and not sour. And finally, question 14, who do you tag? The last time I did a tag, a while ago, I tagged Weston Ritchie, who was, we were communicating a bit back then, and lately she hasn't been on her BookTube channel. I suppose she's busy with work and life, I'd assume, but in case you're in the rafters there and looking for a segue back into doing BookTube videos, here's a tag for you, if it interests you. I thought I'd also tag 2 commenters on my BookTube channel of late who don't make videos of their own, but in case they're interested in answering these questions however they'd like to, in my comments if you'd like, or in a blog post, or however you'd like, if it interests you, I thought I'd tag Beth Knight and JB Subscribes, because you shouldn't have to make videos to participate in BookTube. And also, I'm pretty sure that Steve tagged everyone else I know who makes videos. But in case he didn't tag you and you haven't been tagged and you want to be, consider yourself tagged. That about covers it for me. Man, that felt like a really long and involved book tag. So I'd best get to editing it and what have you. And I hope you enjoyed. And thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.